It is.
So I'm just going to start again because the recording's only just come through now. So
Try one.
this is one of a series of author talks we do for authors that publish through us. And tonight we have Bill Robertson talking about his recent publication, The Undefeated, The Untold Lives of Allied Prisoners of War in Europe, 1939 to 45. I'm just going to say a few words, if I may, Bill, about Barnthorne before we intro you.
Sure,
So
absolutely.
Barnthorne was established in the autumn of 2023 by Ashley Barnett and Neil Thornton. To date, we've published over 50 books, predominantly in the military history genre, and again, within that, predominantly non-fiction, although we do have a few fiction prints as well. The business was set up really because of the frustrations and the opportunity, really, that Neil, in particular, many of you may know Neil's a well-established author. Some of the problems we'd had with some of the bigger publishing houses, and so this was an opportunity really to be able to provide something different to either first-time authors or up-and-coming authors in the military history genre. So, if any of you out there are looking to write your first military history book, please do send it in to submissions@barnthornepublishing.co.uk. Anyway, enough of that. Over to Bill, because that's what this is about this evening. And Bill, perhaps you could just give a little bit of introduction about yourself, your professional background, and your personal background.
Okay, well, I am a history teacher by trade. I graduated from Dundee University way back in the 90s with an MA in modern history and American studies. And then I got into teaching around about the start of the 2000s. So for the last 26 years, I have been a teacher of history, modern studies, and politics. I'm currently head of the Faculty of Humanities at Westhill Academy, which is a large comprehensive school in Aberdeenshire, just outside Aberdeen city itself. But I've always been interested in military history and World War II in particular. So I'd always kind of dreamt when I was at uni and after that at some point that I would write a history book. And here we are.
And what a cracker it is. So, congratulations. It's your first book. And at Barnthorne, we were really delighted to be able to enable you to fulfill your dream, really, and be able to publish a book into the market. So, can you summarize for us what The Undefeated's all about at a reasonably high level?
Sure. Well, I don't want to go down the path of trying to claim that this is an untold story. I think maybe it's a story that's less well known. Allied prisoners of war in Europe in World War II is probably something that most people have an inkling about, which they've probably got through television series, films, popular books, and things like that. But with my own personal family connection to the Second World War, my great grandfather was a prisoner of war, and his story, in some ways, was an inspiration for writing this book. I wanted to tell that story, which I didn't think had been told as well and was as well known by people. What we tended to see was the Great Escape, the Colditz story, Albert RN, all these kind of well-known stories, which focus on the escape side of things and the sort of that side of the experience. Whereas the reality is most prisoners were not escaping. They were enlisted men rather than officers, and quite often they were laboring in coal mines and salt mines. They were working on farms and factories. And that's not to say that they didn't escape, but this kind of slightly glamorized Hollywood version that people sort of knew about wasn't really the story that was out there. And that's the story that I wanted to tell, that this was that to follow these experiences from very early in the war. I mean, the first chapter opens up with some of the very first British Army prisoners captured in France in 1940 before the main German thrust, all the way up to VE Day and beyond. And another thing I wanted to tell was the story about what happened after, because again, quite often the narrative stops at the point of liberation. And I wanted to explore a little bit, at least, about what it was like to come home and what it was like for the families and the generations afterwards. So that was the aim of writing the book, really, when I started the process.
Definitely, and in that sense, it's a very holistic account, really, isn't it? And I suspect we'll get on to this a little bit later. I suspect the experience of some of the prisoners who were captured right at the beginning of the war was probably very different from those who were captured in the final
Yes,
months
in some
of the
ways,
war.
yes.
But we'll come back to that. So the actual writing of the book itself, Bill, how did that journey start?
Well, we're really going back about over a decade at this point. I mean, the book seriously probably started to take shape about 3 years ago, but the journey really started with my great grandfather, who was a prisoner of war captured in 1940. He was part of the 51st Highland Division. Um, and I had found out a little bit about his story through searching through my family tree. And I'd always known he'd been a prisoner of war. It was one of those things that kind of came up in conversation. But you know what it's like when you're a teenager, and you're interested in World War II. You know, the Dam Busters is exciting. The people charging at machine guns and fighting tanks and things like this. That's exciting. And it's like, oh, he was a prisoner of war. That's not very exciting. It's just kind of, he was in a camp and then he left a few years later. And you didn't really appreciate what was going on. So I didn't really think about it seriously, until I'd started this process of investigating a bit about his life. My mum mentioned that the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders Museum had a diary that had belonged to him. So I've got, this isn't his, this is one of someone else. Like the YMCA gave these out to prisoners, as a way of kind of filling the time. Lots of people turned them into kind of scrapbooks, or they wrote poetry or kept diaries and things. And that's essentially what I found. I went with my daughter. We went to the castle. I asked very nicely if they could let us see it. They said absolutely, we could come into the archives. They handed me this fragile little cloth-bound book, and it was mostly photographs. But the first thing that grabbed my attention was the very first page said Stalag Luft 3. And I'd mentioned the Great Escape a few minutes ago, and I don't want to harp on about it, but that's immediately where my mind went. Oh, there's a story here that I don't know about. He was there, um, and looking through the photographs and things, there was lots of officers and people that I would later on kind of manage to identify. But there was just 2 pages of a narrative about from the minute he was captured to kind of arriving to go work down a salt mine. And I remember standing there in the museum, like reading this and just being very moved by this very brief, you know, account that he had given, about being captured. He'd marched for a month across Europe from France through Belgium and Holland to the Rhine. He'd been on these coal barges where they were stuffed in the hold, overcrowded, sailing for miles down the Rhine. And then he gets to a prisoner of war camp, as he put it, just in a terrible state. And it was down a salt mine for him. And he was lucky he got out. He was able to work as an officer's orderly, and he was 40 at the time. So I was about the same age. So there was a real sort of connection. So I thought, I want to know more about all this. This is a story I didn't know about. I thought it was all just digging tunnels and jumping over the fence. Um, so I started to research. I started to find books. I was able to track the camps he was in. So I'd try and find books written by people in these camps. And the thing that struck me was he wasn't in them. And by that, I mean the enlisted men, they weren't in these books. These books were predominantly written by officers. And I mean, I understand it reflects the kind of social class structure, of Britain in the post-war period. I don't want to get on my working class hero hat and kind of make this as like that. I'm banging a drum here. But it's inevitable then that it was the educated kind of officer class people that wrote books after the war, and that kind of established a narrative. And there are books out there written by enlisted men, but they're much less well known. They were probably published in much smaller quantities, and you really had to go digging for these things. So I'd go back and I'd watch Colditz and I'd watch The Great Escape, and I'm like, where are all the old orderlies? Where are all the enlisted men in these camps? So it's like they'd been erased out of the story. So that started me off in this process of collecting these books, trying to find enlisted men accounts, going through the archives. I spent a bit of time down in London at the Imperial War Museum. There was a few diaries and memoirs and things that had been donated there by families that I was able to look at. There was lots of war crimes files that I was interested in looking at, because again, the kind of the cruelty and the barbarity side of captivity isn't always very well explored either. I managed to then pick up other things through auctions, eBay, things like this. So I was able to find like the first chapter about some of the early prisoners of war. I found this astonishing series of photographs of these 16 prisoners from the Duke of Cornwall's light infantry who'd been captured in. It was almost like a World War One trench raid. Having taught the First World War, it definitely kind of sounded a lot like the kind of action you'd have seen there. And here they are being marched past the propaganda photographer. You can see they're wounded. And then from that, I was able to find the record cards that the Germans had kept. So I was able to track them to various camps, and reports and things. And it was great kind of joining up all these dots. And that's kind of how the narrative started to come together. And I realized, well, there's a story here. And then it was shaping that into something that could be published. And I suppose the big break came. I won a raffle, believe it or not. This is a kind of really strange story, but I'd gone to the We Have Ways of Making You Talk History Festival. I'd been invited to. I'd written to them about John, my great granddad's story, and they'd said, "Would you like to kind of do a little bit in the family story section?" And I'd said yes. So while I was there, I bought a raffle ticket, and lo and behold, I was invited on to one of the regular live streams to ask a question. So I was like, "Oh, right, what am I going to?" So, right, prisoners of war, and I asked about this. How do we reframe this narrative that tells the kind of the wider story that's out there that people don't know about? And Al Murray said, "Well, somebody should write a book." And I thought, okay, well, I've been kind of toying with the idea. This is maybe my push. He suggested the idea of, as you said, it was a holistic approach. So he was like, you could make each chapter about a different part of the experience. So I was like, okay, now I've got a structure. Before it was just this kind of big conglomerate of sources and trying to pull together a story out of it. And then James Holland had suggested the Imperial War Museum's audio archives. They said there's these hundreds of hours of tapes. You just search through them, find the prisoner of war accounts, and then you can sort of filter them out by different experiences that you want to find out about. So that's what I did. I started permanent through those, and so that's the book started to kind of take hold at that point. And then a little while after that, I was approached by Ashley and Neil as I was kind of trying to promote myself on social media, saying, I've got this idea for a story. I've got this plan for a book. I'd spoken to a few authors. Luke Turner was one who published a great book called Men at War, which kind of looked at sexuality and relationships during the war. And he was really nice about showing me, like, how do you make a proposal to publishers to kind of convince them that you're not just some dilettante messing about, thinking about writing a book, that you're actually serious. You've thought about the structure of the book, why you should tell the story, how you're going to market it, all these kind of ideas. So there was a lot of people like that. I say James and Al had offered a bit of advice, and various other authors had all kind of chipped in with encouragement and sort of tips and things like that. And that kind of led to Barnthorne at that point. And it was like, I think it was Christmas Eve. I had the deal memo thing, and I was like, okay, I'm going to sign, I'm going to commit to this. And then that started the clock ticking. So it was like, right, now I've got a year to actually write this book. So nothing focuses your mind like a deadline. And that was it. It was sit down, knuckle down. I mean, I am actually sitting in my writing place right at the minute. This is at our dining room table. I don't have a study or an office or somewhere that I can kind of crawl away to. So I'd be here every morning before work. So I'd sit for a bit doing some corrections and going through sources. Then I'd go away, teach all day, come back, make dinner, and then in the evening there I would be camped out again at the laptop till all hours of the night, kind of typing stuff up. And gradually it started to take shape, and it's like
your
I
own
have a book
homework there, Bill. Like your own homework.
Basically, yeah, it was like doing extra homework. But yeah, that was the nature of the beast. But it was the only way I knew I was going to get it finished. I had to get disciplined and get a routine. But like, before that, I'd been kind of pottering about the edges and kind of gathering stuff. But once Barnthorne stepped in, it became a real thing, something that you were working towards. Then there was a publication date, there was an expectation, so it was like, you got to deliver now. That you kind of talked a great game up to this point. Time to put your money where your mouth is, basically.
So just changing tack slightly there. So one of the listeners in tonight, Darren, is thinking of writing a book. What would be
I don't.
what would be, I don't know whether you know him or not, but what would be your advice to a budding first-time author? What were the lessons you learned as you went through the process?
I could tell you lots of things you shouldn't do. But really, you've got to have a very clear idea about what it is you want to write about. I mean, that was one of the things when I mentioned speaking to Luke Turner. He was very much, you've got to have a clear idea, and sitting down to write the book proposal was a great way of going, right, what is this book about? Why am I the person who should tell this story and not somebody else? And for me, that was the personal connection, the fact that this was something very, very personal to me about my family and their experiences, and a story that I wanted to kind of tell. And I couldn't tell John's story directly because he had left so little information. It was just this couple of pages and photographs and names and addresses where I could kind of get around the edges. So it was like I needed to find other men who had gone through the same things to tell the story that he had went through. So that would be the first place. You've got to be very clear about what it is that you want to write about. And then we were talking earlier on about rabbit holes. stick to that, because it is very easy to then find rabbit holes to disappear off down. What's it they call it in the military? Mission creep. It's very easy to get caught up with a bad case of mission creep if you're not careful. But you have the focus on that, and then it's, where am I going to get the information from for this? Is there stuff out there? Is there published sources or there unpublished sources? Where else can I get the information to pull this together? And then think about how you're going to structure the story and so on. So that's the kind of, just to get you off the starting blocks at that point.
Yeah. And then the discipline and making sure that when you've got so many sources, you don't get lost in all of them.
It's very easy to do that. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the actual content of the book itself. And I think you touched on this earlier when you said, the perception of POWs during the Second World War was cold hits and the Great Escape and all those kinds of things. But of course, quite a lot of the prisoners didn't escape at all.
No.
So what proportion of the prisoners of war generally got involved in escaping? And those that didn't, how did they occupy their time in the camps?
Right. Well, it's very difficult to get accurate figures about this. That's one of the things I discovered, because obviously attempted escapes generally aren't recorded. So we only really have the successful attempts of people who got home. For that, we can go to the archives and we can see the MI9 debriefs that people had to fill in to say, how did you escape? Who helped you? Kind of what things have we learned from your escape that we could pass on to other escapers? This kind of thing. I mean, officers have a slightly higher. I mean, if we're being generous, we're saying between 5 and 10% of officers. If we're looking at just enlisted men, I doubt we're getting any more than 5%. If we're talking, there's about 170,000 just kind of British and Commonwealth prisoners. And of them, we're talking between 2 to 5% probably were successful. As I say, attempts, that's not to say people weren't maybe tangentially involved. I mean, one of the narratives I looked at, another guy was an orderly, like my great-grandfather, in the same camp. And one of them was involved in helping to dig a tunnel, and they basically helped get him cleaned up when he would come out, so the Germans wouldn't kind of cotton on to what was going on. Or obviously they were making sure they were looking the other way and not giving the game away when people were up to stuff. So they may be involved in that, or putting rations in for people to escape, donating bits of uniforms and things like that. So they may have been involved in sort of slightly sort of sideways ways rather than directly being involved. But there's a very kind of hard core of people who maybe work under the serial escapers, and then everybody else. Well, there's various reasons. I mean, some of it is some of them felt they had done their bit. They had maybe been involved in some quite ferocious fighting. They had seen, horrible sights. If you think about some of the air crew, some of the stories early on in the book about the air crew are horrific. You're up in a Lancaster at 20,000 feet. It's fallen out of the sky at a great rate of knots. You've got centrifugal force. You're being held up against the canopy. You can't get the doors out. There's this terrifying experience. You may have been wounded. There was one chap out in the desert in a tank, and the tank had been hit, and he's lying there. His leg is hanging off, and he's having to kind of try and hold his artery together and things. It's like, you can understand why people like that don't want to escape. It's like, I've done my bit, or they're traumatized. That the idea of then putting themselves in danger again, because it was a very dangerous business. Things like tunneling, were very hazardous. People were buried in cave-ins and things all the time. And then if you do get out, your chances of getting away are minimal. You don't speak the language. You're not familiar with the culture. I mean, one of the things apparently that gave a lot of escapers away is just they didn't act like Europeans. The way they carried themselves, the way they walked, their whole sort of demeanor just kind of raised flags when they were going through places that people would go, oh, this person is a stranger. You're in a militarized society. Everybody is kind of spying on everybody else. Strangers stand out. So it's very difficult to get away. So if you weren't involved in escaping, well, for enlisted men, quite often you didn't have any option. You were put out to work. So you didn't have time on your hands to escape either. So even if you could think about escaping, you were usually exhausted.
And that explains the differential in the percentage
yes,
levels
that would explain
officers and men.
Officers, because of the Geneva Convention, they are protected from work, basically, them and senior NCOs. So they have a lot more time on their hands to do things like plan escapes, manufacture escape aids, and things like that. Whereas your enlisted men are up against the fact that they are probably also going to have to work. So that was another barrier to escaping in itself. Just you were working, you were locked up in a factory somewhere, and sometimes they would take away your boots and your trousers at night, so that it was much harder for you to escape. So there was all sorts of things in the way. So I mean, you were stuck in the camp, so some of them had to then come to this accommodation with the right. We're not going anywhere in the near future. How do you then fill the time? And it's how you would expect. They read. I mean, the Red Cross made sure as the war went on that lots of library books were sent out so that people could educate themselves or read for pleasure. Lots of Penguin paperbacks and things were sent out as long as they were past the German censors. They did arts and crafts. One of the prisoners I looked at, a guy called James Pardo, he was carving models out of wood. He made tanks and trucks and things, and I was able to get hold of some pictures. Someone contacted me out of the blue when I'd asked for information online. I said, "Oh, I've got some of the stuff this guy Pardo made. Can I send you the pictures?" And I was saying, "Absolutely, I'd love to put them in the book." So people did those kind of things, theatre shows, music, bands, again, through the Red Cross and things, they were able eventually to get instruments. Orchestras and bands kind of sprang up as well. They're usually some prisoners obviously have brought in talents from their pre-army days and things like that they were able to use there. They exercised, they did sports days and things. In some ways, it was a bit like being back at school for them. It was like kind of being in a boarding school with no getting out. So you did classes and things, and it was filling the time as you were kind of working your way towards this indeterminate future where you know that at some point the war's got to end, but when?
And what about the experiences of the prisoners? Did they vary depending on which part of Europe they were held in?
Yes, that was something that because I didn't really know a lot about Italian POW camps until I started researching because I was a bit more familiar with the kind of the classic German Stalag experience. Um, what I tended to find is I think definitely if you were in Italian camps, the experience was in some ways worse. I mean, I don't want to lean into national stereotypes, but it does seem like the German camps, at least after the initial phase of the war, were much better organized. Italian camps seemed to be very ill organized, and there was a kind of mixture of a little bit of cruelty, but and also indifference, but also just incompetence in the way the camps were run. So generally, the rations were poorer, less frequent. The guards could often be much more brutal in Italian camps, and the conditions as well tended to be a bit worse because of the climate. So if you were in North Africa, a lot of men were there in sort of transit camps for a long time, so there was lots of cases of dysentery and other various diseases, and then they were shipped across to the mainland of Italy in cargo ships that weren't marked as carrying prisoners. So you then ran the risk. The Mediterranean's full of Allied submarines, and there's a couple of accounts in the book of ships that were torpedoed, unfortunately, because the submarine crews had no way of knowing that these weren't merchant ships carrying war goods. So they did their job. They fired torpedoes at the ships, and in one case, I think there was about 800 men went down with one of these ships. Mostly drowning in the hold as it went down. It was a horrific experience. So I would have to say the Italian camps, on balance, from what I've read, seemed worse than the German camps in a lot of ways.
Hmm. And we touched on this slightly earlier, where, as I said, your book is very holistic in the sense it covers right from the beginning of the war and unusually, which many books on prisoners of war don't, what happened to a lot of these characters you write about after the war and the impact that being prisoners had on them. But I suppose the thing that I'm interested in is you had those who were captured as part of the disastrous BEF campaign in northwest Europe, in France, right at the beginning of the war, probably late 1939, early 1940, right through to those who were captured, probably in Operation Varsity in March 1945. And what their experiences must have been very, very different.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, partly I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago that one of the things was very early in the war. I think the Germans were captured very unprepared. I don't think they anticipated quite how many prisoners they were going to take in 1940. The fact that the French surrendered completely. So you got France, Belgium, both out of the war, most of the BEF captured. They suddenly have literally millions of prisoners on their hands, and the infrastructure isn't there to support them. So these early war prisoners, yes, there is an element of cruelty and deliberate sort of barbarism in some of the treatment. But the fact is, a lot of men are in temporary camps and things because they haven't developed enough places to put people in initially. And then things like organizing Red Cross parcels and support for prisoners, again, it just all takes time to kick in. So those early war prisoners definitely had a much harder sort of run of it at the beginning until things sort of sorted themselves out. The other thing, again, is at the early stage of the war, if you're captured in France or in Crete, and then some of the early North African battles, again, the war is going very badly for the Allies. And at that point, it maybe looks like it's going to all be over for your side. There's not much hope to kind of get you through your captivity, thinking, well, it's fine. I just need to hang on. You know, the tide is going to turn. We're going to win in the end. Whereas if you're captured, as you say, in something like Varsity or in Arnhem, those guys tended to be much more confident. They knew the war was turning against the Germans. So it was like, okay, I've been captured. Tough luck for me, but it's not going to be long now till this war is over. We can see the end in sight at that point. So I think psychologically, they were much better equipped at that point. That's one of the things the book goes into at the beginning. The psychological impact of capture is everyone thinks about being killed or wounded, but no one thinks about being taken prisoners. So that shock to the system that a lot of men got at the beginning. This is a bit, but we're the British Army. We're part of the greatest empire in the world. How can we have lost? That's a huge blow to men. Whereas, you know, after D-Day and Market Garden and things like that, there's a different mindset in place, and you know they can see that the end is coming. So that helps them get through. The conditions aren't necessarily any better, but they're just better equipped mentally to cope with them.
Yeah, the book covers that really well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Particularly, you know, you describe it for enlisted men, but particularly for officers, the ignominy of being captured, the disgrace almost. A lot of them carried that for quite a good part of their lives beyond the camps.
Yes,
So,
I think there's an impression, Rupert,
no,
that this again, this is something I was keen to challenge. This is that they were sitting out the war in comfort, and especially I think, and it's an unfair comparison, but when people saw the stories of the men in the camps in the Far East and the treatment they'd endured, the treatment that they had in Europe seemed, by comparison, to be quite mild. So yes, there was this element of like, you guys have had an easy war. You just kind of sat it out on the sidelines. And that was kind of the whole thesis of the book is no, that's why it's called The Undefeated. These guys were fighting a war in a different way, in their own way, as much as they could from inside these camps, psychologically, as much as anything else to get through it. And it wasn't the kind of holiday camp that people maybe thought it was.
and what about this on a slightly more or tricky subject? What about intimate relationships that may or may not have occurred in the camps? You don't see much of that in the kind of more popular narratives about the prisoner of war camps.
Yeah. Well, again, I think that it reflects the kind of post-war culture. I mean, obviously, it's not something people in polite company would have talked about. And it's only sort of now in the more modern era where we're starting to unpick these stories and find out a bit more about what kind of went on in private. But a lot of the narratives kind of gloss over it quite tastefully and don't mention it. But the reality is you have thousands of young men separated from female companionship in these camps, and nature is going to find a way, whether it's through masturbation, which, as you might imagine, was quite frequent for some men, but again, maybe not as frequent as you might think, because there is a real lack of privacy in these camps. It's unless you're prepared to discreetly look the other way, it's very difficult to do that. But also, there was very deep, intense personal friendships, which sometimes developed into love affairs, with some men finding companionship with their fellow prisoners, either because they were already homosexual before they were made prisoners, or this was something that they had suppressed. I mean, again, we have to remember that homosexuality was illegal in Britain at that time, so it tended to be something that was very much kind of brushed under the carpet. And then there is an element as well of what we call situational homosexuality, where it is a case of a bit like if you look at studies of prison, that some men, again, just for sexual release, will temporarily cultivate homosexual relationships just as a way of kind of fulfilling that need in themselves, and then they can return to heterosexual behavior after their release. As well as that, maybe the more surprising side for me was the relationships outside the camps, because again, some of these men were out in working parties. They were staying in farms and things with fairly small groups of prisoners and families and things like that. And they had access to women. And we have to remember that Germany is a country at war. and many of their menfolk are out on the front lines or on the Eastern Front and elsewhere. And a lot of these young women are looking for male companionship. And again, relationships sprang up where opportunities arose, where people are out from under scrutiny. I mean, the Germans took it serious enough that they had passed laws to try and prevent any kind of fraternization. It was very deeply frowned upon if women were caught having relationships with POWs. But again, there was a racial element. So British and French POWs, the punishment tended to be fairly mild, but Poles and Russians, Russians in particular, could find themselves executed for sleeping with German women. So there was a bit of a double standard being applied there as well. So that was something a bit more surprising, that this was something that actually happened, because again, we don't associate men in the barbed wire camps with sexual relationships with civilians outside. So that was a bit of an eye opener to kind of pull out that. I think there's a bit more work to be done there, actually, that there's a lot more to be explored.
And presumably that aspect of the camp life was more prevalent with the enlisted men because they were out of the camps working,
Yes.
as opposed to the officers who didn't work and
Absolutely,
were kept in
yes.
the camps. Yeah. And what about repatriation? What can you tell us about both the successful and failed attempts at repatriating prisoners?
Yes. Well, the Geneva Convention, again, makes this provision that people shouldn't be kept prisoners for any longer than necessary, really. So prisoners who are wounded and obviously unfit for further combat duty are supposed to be returned to their home nation as soon as practical, basically. So there's a process written into the Geneva Convention. This is supposed to happen, that the belligerent powers have to get together and basically agree to trade prisoners to take these people back again. And then on top of that, you also have what we call protected personnel. So amongst the armed forces, you have all the medical teams, so the REMC, in the British Army, obviously the doctors, medical orderlies, and people there. They're non-combatants, so they are also protected, and chaplains, and the kind of spiritual side of things as well. So they are also supposed to be returned, but there is a catch in that there has to be enough left behind in the camps to administer to the needs of the prisoners that are still being kept. So an unfortunate number of chaplains and medical personnel have to stay behind. They aren't necessarily put up for repatriation because they have to keep a certain percentage of doctors and chaplains and so on to look after those. But the wounded people, what happened would be there's something called a mixed medical commission. So you'd have German doctors, and then you would have, initially it was American doctors, because America was neutral at the start of the war, obviously. Once they come into the war, the Swiss take over, and they see men who have been nominated basically by the camp staff. So the medical personnel there would say, well, this person here has been blinded or has lost a limb or something like that, so we think they should be sent home. And that was the process. Basically, that you would be examined, and they would sort of look at your reasons for being sent home and then decide whether you should be chosen or not. The problem at the start of the war, of course, was that there was a very disproportionate number of prisoners. We had hardly any Germans in captivity. It's mostly air crew shot down in the Battle of Britain, people captured from sunken ships and stuff. There's very few army prisoners, whereas the Germans have a huge chunk of the BEF, and then they capture men in Crete and they capture men in North Africa. So they have thousands of men, and they are understandably maybe unwilling to just start handing over people in what they feel is an unfair exchange. Now, it's not supposed to be according to the Geneva Convention. It doesn't have to be man for man, but their point, they felt, was this is an unbalanced exchange. So it took some time, and the first exchange actually fell apart basically over this question of numbers of prisoners. And it got to the point, unfortunately, where there were prisoners, both Germans, I think they were in Ramsgate, actually literally loaded onto ships waiting to sail. And there were British prisoners on the Channel coast in camps they'd been taken to there, waiting to board ships. And at the 11th hour, the British government pulled the plug. They felt the Germans had pushed their luck. And these poor guys were told, I'm sorry, you're going back to the camp again. It's over. Fortunately, once the Germans start to lose more men as prisoners, their attitude changes and further exchanges are set up. So generally what would happen is there were ships from Sweden, a lot of neutral ships from Sweden that the Red Cross basically ran, and they would do these voyages to France, for example, where they would pick up people at the Channel ports, and then they would take them back to the UK on these hospital ships, basically, to then have them repatriated. Now they were supposed to be non-combatants, but there were a few people who apparently were also fit enough to go back to combat. So there were people who maybe had oversold a little bit their injuries, and then there were, of course, a few people who did fake injuries and illnesses to try and get out. And I had a very kind of mixed feelings about this, because I understand on the one hand they want to get out, they want to get back, and they want to get back into the war. But every person who puts one over on the Mixed Medical Commission and gets out is keeping another man back in a camp who could be going home, basically. So it's I had kind of mixed feelings about that side of things, basically. But yeah, it was interesting to see actually how much was involved in terms of the amount of voyages right up to almost the end of the war, till 1945. They were still exchanging prisoners, just in the dying days of the war, that this process was still going on.
Yeah, I think that's an aspect of the POW experience that isn't really that well known. So it's great that you bring that out in the book. What about tell us a little bit about the last winter of the war, and in particular as the Red Army were advancing across Poland and then into Germany, how the Germans reacted to that.
Yes. Well, there seems to have been a mindset amongst the Germans that they didn't want these prisoners to fall into Soviet hands, basically. I think that the idea seems to have been that they thought these were bargaining chips, basically. That they could hold on to these men and use them to negotiate with the Allies, even though the Allies had said they want an unconditional surrender. And think, but this is our ace in the hole. We have all these thousands of prisoners. We can use that to our advantage here. So as the Russians get closer, and there's lots of these accounts from diaries of men, and they can hear the guns every day. The Russian planes are flying over, and so on, and they know they're close. And as you say, this is like sort of February, in the depths of winter. It's the 1940s must have had some of the worst winters of the 20th century. It seems like, from all these accounts, and they're told, right, pack your stuff. You're being marched out of here, and you're going west to the camps on the other side, basically away from the Eastern Front. So you have these huge marches of thousands of prisoners, all leaving from these camps in the east, from sort of Poland and Silesia and so on, and they're being marched into kind of the western side of Germany, in this appalling weather, sub-zero temperatures. They've got very little in the way of protective clothing or anything. They're being marched miles. There's hardly any food, but they've got some Red Cross parcels they can take with them. Um, and they are just, people are dropping like flies with frostbite and dysentery, and it's a horrendous experience. And they've eventually, a lot of the prisoners who experience it christen them the death marches. Basically, that this is such a horrific, and again, not so well known experience, that these men went through. With the war being so close to an end, and yet they are still enduring this terrible experience where they've got no choice, because they've no ability to kind of say, no, we're not doing this. You're being pushed at gunpoint, and if you don't keep up, men were shot, as far as we can tell from the accounts, that that was the incentive to keep moving. If you were lucky, you might get an outbuilding or a farm to stop for the night. If you weren't lucky, you just had to huddle together in a field and hope that you didn't die of frostbite. So it's a terrible experience, and a lot of men, were scarred, I think, for life by what happened to them. And then on top of that, as we get closer to the end of the war, you have these horrible friendly fire incidents, and there's several, that I report in the book, of Allied planes, basically, because you can imagine from the air, you're flying at sort of 400 miles an hour in a typhoon, or a thunderbolt. You just see a column of men, marching down the road. You don't know whether they're Germans or not, but you assume they're the enemy, and you unload your bombs and your rockets, and there's lots of men who are killed, unfortunately, in these friendly fire incidents, because the pilots they can't distinguish friend from foe, and they're just roaming the countryside at this point looking for targets of opportunity. And lots of men are killed in these incidents, unfortunately. So again, that was something that I was keen to kind of communicate to people, that this was happening.
And during the time they were prisoners, what was the kind of contact, if any, with their loved ones? So after someone was captured, how would people back in Britain, if they're British or in France or in
Yeah,
Belgium or wherever, how would they actually know what had happened to their loved
yeah.
ones?
Well, you'd be posted missing by the War Department. So that was usually the first inkling that you would get. The government would contact you. You'd get the telegram saying, "I regret to inform you that your husband, your son, or whatever has been posted missing. We don't know what's happened to them at this stage." The men who were captured, they were given Red Cross cards to fill in, which would basically just have like cross out, "I am well, wounded," or whatever. It would have fill in their information, and that would be sent home to people. But those could take months to kind of work their way through the system before people got official notification to say they were alive. So again, some of the accounts I looked at, you had men waiting, not knowing whether their families knew whether they were alive or dead at this point, and then waiting for letters to come back. That's something that comes through in a lot of the letters, this anxiety over when are you going to write to me next? And just because of the nature of the fact that you're in the middle of a conflict, I mean, and even though the mail is supposed to get through to these men as part of the arrangements that both sides had, inevitably things get held up, ships get sunk, trains get derailed, and letters go astray. Also, with men moving from camp to camp, sometimes the letters have to catch them up. So some of them you'll see they've got several stamps on them as they've gone not to this camp, they're in the next camp and forwarded on. So once the kind of war settles down for a bit, that becomes a little bit better established. And they are allowed a limited amount. They're allowed so many postcards and one sort of letter every month. They have these kind of little single-sided postcards that they could fill in with some very brief information, and of course, all subject to censorship. So they have to be careful about what they put in them. So they couldn't sometimes express maybe as much in terms of personal feelings and emotions as they would like to sometimes. And obviously, talking about the war was quite tricky, so you have to keep things quite bland in some cases.
Hmm. So, through writing the book, has your view of what prisoners of war went through during the war, has it changed, or has it reaffirmed what you always thought?
It's definitely changed. I mean, to think of the journey I've gone on in the sort of last decade, from sort of thinking prisoners of war was not really a particularly interesting subject, and again, subscribing to this view that it was just kind of there was nothing much happening. You just kind of sat the war out on the sidelines. To go and no, this was actually you were as much risk in some ways as some of the men who were actually not captured, and if not more so in some cases, that you go through this experience of being captured where you don't even know at the point where you've surrendered whether you are going to be kept alive or not. And again, there's a couple of incidents in the book. One, John Kane, who was a friend of my great granddad's, um, he is he and his friends are shot by a group of German soldiers. They're taken prisoner, and because they're not particularly cooperative, the guy just pulls out a gun and mows them down. And John Kane's shot in the face, but thankfully survives. So you have that whole uncertainty over whether you're going to survive or not. And then you had in 1940 these horrible marches, across Europe to these camps, and then the experiences they had there with the lack of food, people starving a lot of the time, people being ill, and then you survive that, and you are working in coal mines, salt mines, factories. You are subject to brutal behavior from guards if you don't obey orders. I mean, there's one incident in the book, a guy's told to go milk cows, and he says, I'm not supposed to milk cows. That's not my job. The guy comes back with a rifle and shoots him in his bed. And it's like, you are, inches away from death at any minute in these camps. And it's fine that one minute you can be on stage, performing in a camp show, but the next minute, if you look at a guard wrong, you can be beaten up or you can be shot. And then, as you say, at the end of the war, you're taken on these terrible treks through freezing cold winters under air attack from your own forces, and it's unrelenting misery in some cases. So I have a really deep appreciation now for the experiences they went through. And as I say, this thing with my great granddad, the fact that we were roughly the same age when he was going through this experience, and I think we all had a bit of an inkling of that during COVID. I hate to raise the specter of COVID again, but we had that. I mean, not that I'm making a direct comparison before anyone thinks that, but the fact that we were very limited in our contact with our loved ones, that we couldn't travel very far from our homes. We were kind of in this, when is this going to end? Is it going to be next week? Is it going to be next year? When's a vaccine going to come? And we didn't know. And that was a slight inkling of it. That must have been what it was like. You're in one of these camps, you're like, when is the war over? When is it going to change? Nothing seems to be moving. The Germans seem to have the whip hand. Like those poor guys in Italy, they think, yes, we're being liberated. And then the Germans come and take the camps over and start shipping them off to Germany again, and it's just like they have the rug pulled out from you like that all the time. So absolutely, my appreciation deepened massively the more I dug into this book and the more I went through the process of writing it.
Well, I suppose in a way, the mental health issues that we're so alive to in today's
Yeah.
community just wasn't the case. It just wasn't prevalent at
Yes.
that time. And people, I suppose, were probably suffering enormously from mental health problems, but might I suggest we're probably just a bit more stoic about the environment and what their plight was.
Yeah, that definitely seems to be the case. I mean, it was one of the things I did was when I started writing the book is I put an appeal out on various social media platforms to people saying, if you had a father, a grandfather, a relative who had been a prisoner of war, I would love to hear their story and maybe find out a bit more about them. And I was lucky that quite a few people came forward. But so something that kind of grew out of that was I wonder what it was like for them when their loved ones came back. How did they react? Was it this stoicism where it was all kind of kept under the surface, or where was there another kind of darker side to it? And it seems to be a real mixed bag from people I spoke to. Some people, said, "Oh, Dad never really talked about it. If he did talk about it, it was just funny stories about things that happened in the camp." And then other people would say, "Well, yeah, it seemed normal, but then Dad would get night terrors." And he'd be screaming every night, and he was always really funny about food. He hated waste, and they had all these kind of sort of weird sort of obsessions about stuff that seemed to be an offshoot of the POW experience. I think I saw John West as one of the people in the chat. He wrote a book about his father's experiences called The Psychiatrist, which I'd read as part of the preparation for the book, and that was quite enlightening. That was the way that he had sort of dealt with his trauma, was to think about other people's mental health, ironically, as a way of kind of processing his own experiences. I think so. That was something that came out of it. It's maybe not quite as stoic as we thought, but definitely that kind of post-war generation did probably talk about mental health a lot less, and it was just sort of, yeah, you had to get on with it. There wasn't very much done for them when they did come home. I mean, there was some provision, but it was very much voluntary, where you were sent off for a few weeks at kind of rehabilitation centres where they would try and kind of a bit like a deep sea diver decompressing, where they would kind of sort of readjust you to civilian life. They printed pamphlets for families like, how to deal with your POW relatives. They're going to be a bit strange when they come back. Be gentle with them, all this kind of stuff. But I think most people, like my great granddad, they just got on with their lives again when they came back. And say my mum told me her granddad never spoke to her much about it. And one of the things that she said since reading the book is she has a much greater understanding now of what he must have gone through because he never shared that with them. So I'm quite proud of the fact that I was able to do that for my own family, to say, guys, this is what they went through. So yeah.
And aside from your great grandfather, obviously there's the emotional attachment there. Out of all the people you've written about in the book, who's the one person who stands out in your mind as the most resilient, or the
Oh,
person that put up with the most hardship? Is there any one person that sticks
oh
out in your mind?
God, there's a few. Just there was an RAF flight sergeant who was a radio operator called Cuthbert Collingwood, who has this incredible story. He gets shot down over Schweinfurt in I think 1943 or thereabouts, but he passes out when he jumps out of his plane. He is wounded and he's coughing up blood and stuff, and he doesn't really know why. So he gets taken to a hospital in Frankfurt. He's operated on while he's conscious. He's strapped to a chair, sorry, to a bed while they operate on. He's got a hemorrhage in the back of his throat caused by a splinter or a bullet. And while he's in hospital, the RAF plastered the place with 800 bombers, and the hospital is destroyed. He ends up in an air raid shelter then out in the street while the RAF are bombing this camp. And he has this incredible sort of epiphany of like, that would have been me up there normally, and here I am on the ground, and he's cursing Hitler and everybody for putting him in this situation, that people are doing this to each other. And he pops up time and time again kind of through the book because he has these experiences, and then he makes it all the way to the end of the war and finally gets home again. So his story was really interesting. It was really well written. Frank Carruthers was another one who came to me from my friend Nick Livingston. This is his granddad. He had an unpublished book. He was a journalist before the war, and he writes really vividly about his experiences and some of the stuff in the chapter about the Holocaust. It's Frank that I leaned on really heavily because he describes the march from the camp. He was in a camp sort of linked to the Auschwitz complex. So he is seeing the horrible abuses of Jewish prisoners, and as they're marching out, there's the bodies lining the side of the road, and he has these beautifully written but horrific descriptions of things. So that really stuck in my mind again. The experience that, again, this was something I wasn't so aware of, that the prisoners were quite often Holocaust adjacent, if you like. If they weren't sort of directly involved, they quite often were seeing what was going on from their own camps and being involved in mixed working parties and things like that. And Morris Brown is one, I think, who convinced me to write the book, because I got his unpublished diary from an auction that he had tried to publish himself in the 60s, and he was told, "Oh, you're too late. The fad for World War II books has kind of gone out." But he'd escaped from France. He'd been in France in 1940. He had missed the whole Dunkirk debacle. He was after Dunkirk. He got home. He went to North Africa. He gets captured there at Tobruk, and then he spends the rest of the war in Italy, and then in Germany. He misses being repatriated again. You see his hopes rising as he thinks they're about to go home, and it's dashed. And he just kind of keeps bouncing back time and time after again. And I'm really pleased in some ways. I don't know if any of Morris's family are still out there somewhere. I'm assuming his papers ended up at the auction house, maybe because he's passed away and there was no one to kind of pass them on to. But the fact that he wanted to publish his own book and I managed to get his story out there as well was something I was really pleased I was able to do. And I really felt, after, a real affection for him after spending so much time sort of reliving his wartime experiences. So that he was another one who stuck in my mind. It was great to kind of bring out these stories that people hadn't heard before and put them in the book.
We've got a few questions in the meeting chat. 3 questions, all from Darren, which I'm going to fire at you if that's okay, Bill.
Sure.
First one: have you been in touch with Simon Errington, Red 5 models? I believe his grandfather was an ETO POW and went on the Long March.
He was. I know Simon and Darren a little bit through social media, and I've sort of come across Simon at the We Have Ways of Making You Talk festival. He's very much into models and stuff, and I am aware that his granddad was a prisoner of war, and I've sort of messaged a couple of things back and forward saying, "Oh, I've got some books about." I think he was Durham Light Infantry or something, and I've got a couple of books that I'd come across that have stories from prisoners from that unit, which I should really pass on to him at some point. So yeah, I should probably get in touch with him and see if he's interested. So I think he's toying with the idea of maybe either writing a book or just he wants to find out a bit more about the experiences himself to kind of dig into it a bit more.
Okay, the second question: did the POW questionnaires give up any clues of their mental state when we were talking about mental health earlier on, or as said, they just sucked it up, really, to put it mildly?
Not a massive amount. Sorry.
Yeah, no, go on. You answer that question. There's another
Yeah,
one.
well, the thing about the POW questionnaires is, for a start, hardly anybody filled them in. Um, Only a certain percentage, and some of them are very, very minimal. It's just no, yes, go through a line. Did you try and escape? No. What camps were you in? There you go. And that's it. Some of them are much more detailed. So if you're lucky, sometimes you'll find there's extra pages stapled on where there's been escape attempts or things like that. But they still tend to be quite matter of fact. And so, other than talking about maybe ill treatment, or things that they did in terms of, like, they were quite useful for finding out about sabotage. Quite a lot talked about things that they'd done in terms of factories they worked in where they kind of monkeyed with machines or interrupted work processes and things like that. But not very much in terms of mental health state. No, not very much at all.
And the second part of the question is how did theirs, and I assume that means the questionnaires, or their mental states, compare with the Far Eastern prisoners of war?
Well, I haven't made any direct comparisons. I'm only just starting to dig into Far East prisoners of war at the minute for my next book.
Well, we're going to come on to that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it may not be my next book, but it's what I'm thinking is my next book at the minute. One of the things, because a lot of people ask at times, "Are you not covering Far East prisoners?" And I just felt I already had quite a lot with the European theatre, and it was going to double the size of the book if we did. And I wanted to kind of let it stand on its own, to do that. So again, from what I have read from Far East prisoners, there's a similar kind of tone of resilience, but the experience is very different in terms of the particular barbarity and cruelty that they face from their captors there. Whereas at least the Germans, while they did do a lot of stuff that would be classed as war crimes and ill treatment. Generally, they more or less at least tried to pay lip service to the Geneva Convention and did try and at least feed and not murder their prisoners at the drop of a hat kind of thing. So in some aspects, it was maybe slightly easier to maintain a kind of positive mental outlook than it was in some of these Far Eastern camps where you were being worked to death, basically. So, but I haven't done any kind of detailed comparisons at this point.
And Darren's last question, which John West has helpfully put a comment on, were they told not to talk about their experiences in the prisoner of war camps as they did with the Far Eastern prisoners of war? And John's helpfully said, least said, soon as forgotten was the official line.
Well, I haven't come across any particularly official documentation to suggest that. But again, I think it just reflects the attitudes at the time, that it was very much considered like, well, that's past. You're now in the present and working towards the future. So yeah, there's not really much point going on about it. And I think, again, like men who've been in combat, a lot of people found that even if they did want to talk about it, nobody really wanted to listen. And it was difficult to communicate to people what they'd been through because they hadn't lived it themselves. If you've been back in Britain, you've had your own hardships to face with rationing and bombing and things like that. They're trying to explain to them what it was like to march through, 20 degrees below temperature with frozen corpses lining the road while you're starving, or squatting at the side of the road, doubled over with dysentery. Who wants to tell that story to their kids or to their wife? I think, understandably, they didn't want to share these things. So I don't even know if they needed much in terms of official encouragement to just like not talk about it. But I don't think there was a sort of like, don't discuss this. It's sort of, not the done thing to do, lads. It was more just, I think it was just accepted. You just didn't want to speak about it.
Yeah. So a couple of final questions from me, Bill, and I think you touched on this already. Come on, tell us about the next book.
Well, I've got a few irons in the fire, but where I've seemed to end up at the minute is I'm quite interested, and this was kind of a tangent of research in this book. Two of the things that I kind of took out because it was required on a lot of officer accounts, and that was kind of the whole raison d'etre of the book, was to be enlisted men, was the chaplains and the doctors. So I've kind of set those two ideas aside. So at the minute, I'm looking at the doctors, and I'd like to do something about what it was like to have to provide medical care in these camps and do something with the Far East and Europe to kind of compare. And at the minute, there seems to be certainly a lot more information because the doctors seem to have had a lot more going on in the Far Eastern camps in terms of having to provide medical care because of the conditions that the men were in. But equally, there were privations and very little in the way of equipment and medicines in the European camps as well. So I'm trying to pull together that. And so I'm at that kind of hunter-gatherer phase at the minute where I'm ploughing through some of the documents that I've got. There's a stack of memoirs and things that need to be ploughed through. And I'm hoping what should happen after that is a narrative of some kind should start to come out of that, and that's will form the focus of the book. So that's where I'm at the minute.
So a couple of comments in the chat room. Firstly, from Darren, you might know this through your social media contact with him. His great uncle was a Far Eastern prisoner, captured in the Battle of Singapore with the Royal Norfolks, and had a very hard 3.5 years in captivity, working on the railway, the Burma to Thailand Railway, and suffered a lot when he came home. And then John's just dropped in that he's got a fantastic Royal Army Medical Corps diary available for you. He's going to message you about that.
Super. It's one of the. I think this couldn't have happened in an earlier time. We are so lucky in some ways. While social media is often a curse, it has been fantastic for reaching out to people who I would never have been able to make contact with and have access to resources. Again, I'm sat here at my dining room table, and about 90% of the time researching the book was here on the internet or with books or finding stuff online. And I've been in grand total, I spent 3 days in London at the archives. I would have loved to have spent more, but that was all the time in about 3 years of writing I spent actually sort of leaving the house to go and find sources that I couldn't get anywhere else. And stuff was just coming into me through my emails and through social media and things like that. So again, had I tried to do this even sort of 20 years ago, I probably wouldn't have had half the luck I would have had tracking down a lot of these sources.
And I suppose in a way, that's one of the positive things that came out of COVID.
Yes.
When we look back. So, Bill, I think we're probably going to draw that to a close. So, Bill's book that's come out, which we were delighted to publish, is available for purchase from our website, which is www.barnthornepublishing.co.uk, or via Amazon. I'd like to thank Bill
Thank you.
for
My
taking the
pleasure.
time tonight, and thank all of you for listening to Bill's story. It's a superb story. In terms of things, forthcoming titles that we're currently working on, which should come out over the next few months, we've got a book on Arnhem headstones by that Arnhem expert Neil Cherry on its way. We've got a book about escapes made from the Channel Islands, which I don't think anyone's written a book about yet, which is coming out fairly shortly by someone based in the Channel Islands. And we've got a book coming out about the English communists who went and fought for the nationalist cause, sorry, the Republican cause in the Spanish Civil War. So those are things to watch out for on our website. Bill, thank you so much for giving
You're
us your
welcome.
time this evening and for explaining what sounds. I had the luck of being able to read it. Actually, it's a cracking book, but I'm a mere mortal when it comes to one particular reviewer that you've had who's reviewed a book. Do you want to just quickly share that with the audience before we close it
Uh,
down?
well, I did already share it on social media, but I'm not sure I could repeat the word that was used. But Al Murray, who has been a big supporter of the book, and in fact, I went to send him one as a thank you that I'd signed, and I'd found out through a mutual acquaintance that he'd already bought his own book. So I was absolutely thrilled to hear that. But he was on the We Have Ways of Making You Talk live stream on Monday, holding up my book, him and James Holland, and he says it's a cracker. That's not the words he used on Monday. He said it was effing amazing. So I will take that as a full quote any day of the week. I can't pay for feedback like that. So he seems to have genuinely he has read the book and thinks it is a great piece of research and a great bit right. And I'm really happy because I met him before the book came out and he was like, "When is the book coming out?" And I said, "Oh, it's been the manuscript's just been prepared for publication and stuff. So I'm kind of just waiting, but I'm kind of nervous because what if it comes out and everybody hates it and thinks it's awful?" And he's like, "Yes, it's a really terrible time, kind of." Because I'm like, "But why would you worry about negative reviews? Surely people are." And he's like, "No, no, I have the exact same fear that." People are going to come out and slate your work and all the rest of it. So I was living in this whole like, oh, people are just going to read it and go, well, it's a good try, but yeah, I've read it before or whatever. But so far, everybody who isn't related to me even has been, this is a cracking book. It's been a fascinating read. They've found out things that they didn't know before. So if I've managed to do that was the whole point in the first place, was to tell people this story that they hadn't heard fully. If it's done that, if it's helped change that paradigm a little bit about how people view European prisoners of war, then I've done my job and I can sort of be proud of that.
On to the next one.
Yes, and on to the next one.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming along this evening.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
again, Bill. All the best.